Welcome to the Festival of Dangerous Ideas podcast. Our 10th festival, like thousands of other events, was no longer able to proceed due to the rapidly evolving situation around COVID-19. While our 10th anniversary is postponed, we have 9 years of stimulating dangerous ideas in the archive to ponder, reminding us of the eerily relevant conversations that take place at the festival each year. At the beginning of her 2016 talk, economic policy advisor Jennifer Rayner quotes leading economist Chris Richardson, saying, "There is a stunning generational unfairness in our settings, and all those disengaged young Australians need to wake up to the fact that they're being massively screwed." In this session, Rayner warns us of the demographic, economic and social change that are affecting young Australians. If we don't act to fix the skews in our system, these issues will lead to a further rise in generational inequality. Please enjoy Jennifer Rayner, Generation X.
So yes, I was born in 1986 and I turned 30 not that long ago. At that age, my mum and dad were settled, prosperous parents of 3. They were homeowners. They were tenured workers tucking away super and long service leave. They were the possessors of both everyday and special occasion cutlery. So naturally enough, they were the benchmark that I instinctively set my expectations against. Growing up in that striving suburbia of Hawke and Howard, my friends and I never doubted that we would lead lives more prosperous, more secure than theirs. I was confident that we'd continue that golden trend tracing back to the Great Depression. Yet another Australian generation to enjoy more wealth and more opportunity than our parents did. But I'll tell you what, today I'm not so sure. When I look around the bar on a Friday after 5, I see young people squeezed by creeping pressures that are not of their making and largely beyond their control. I see 20-somethings living out an ever-extending adolescence as the building blocks for a stable, secure life get further out of reach. I hear treacle black jokes and brittle laughter about retiring beyond 50 and renting beyond the grave. I see my generation becoming the first in over 80 years to go backwards in work, wealth and wellbeing. So I've come here today with a warning about the waves of demographic, economic and social change that are now breaking over today's young Australians. Left unchecked, these changes will lead to rising intergenerational inequality in this country. Just as we've seen a growing gap between the rich and the poor in recent decades, we're beginning to see young and old pull apart in ways that will wear at our communal bonds. Now, if you're uncomfortable taking my word for it as a young woman, allow me to deliver you the same message from an old white man instead, because I know how people like that. In February 2014, the leading economist and Deloitte Access Economics Director Chris Richardson told the Australian Financial Review, "There is a stunning generational unfairness in our settings, and all those disengaged young Australians need to wake up to the fact they're being massively screwed." It isn't just young Australians who need to wake up to this fact, it's all of us. This country is so busy talking about planning for the looming tsunami of our frail aged that we're letting an entire generation fall behind. If we don't think harder about building a future for the old and the young, my generation will be just the first of many to face lives of shrinking opportunity. Now, I don't believe Australians want that. I think we want to be a community that does right by all its people, a country that can take care of the old, but without making second-class citizens of the young. To do that, first we need to recognise where we're going wrong. Then we have to find the will to fix it. In the next 20 minutes or so, I'm going to take you on a lightning tour of the growing gaps between young and old so you can see where things are going wrong for us at work, in our wealth, and also with our wellbeing. If you leave here thinking that my generation are a pack of whingers who don't know how good they've got it, you won't have been paying attention. A truly equal Australia is one where young Australians have the same opportunities to build stable, secure lives as our parents and grandparents enjoyed before us. The alternative, and the way we're going right now, will see young people become bystanders to this country's prosperity as older people claim an ever greater share of its building blocks. But it's not too late to turn this around. So, let's talk about how we do it. The foundation for a good life is a good job, so let's start with work. Here's some things I gained in 5 years juggling crap jobs in restaurants and bars across Canberra. A revulsion for the milky sweet smell of Baileys. The ability to count up to 10 in Thai. Nung song sam si ha hok jet pat gao sip. The ability to tell which customers are likely to be waiting for you in the car park at the end of your shift. Some things I did not gain. More than $3,000 in superannuation, sick pay, permanent work or transferable skills. These crap jobs are increasingly all that young Australians can get as we struggle to navigate our first steps into the jobs market. The economics editor of The Australian, David Uren, has written that it is now harder for young people to get reliable, well-paid work than at any time since the early 1990s. And back then, there was a vast recession on. Many of the doorways that our parents and grandparents passed through on their way to full employment have been closed and bricked up for good. Now, that's because the world of work is changing. Everybody knows that. But while the changing nature of work affects us all, not all of us have been equally affected. In fact, the work gaps that have always existed between green workers and grey ones have widened out significantly over the last 30 years. Taken together, underemployment, casualisation and much slower wage growth risk creating a working underclass of the young. Back in 1978, when my parents were leaving school and starting to look for work, fewer than 1 in 30 young Australians said that they were underemployed. Today, that figure stands at 1 in 6. It's 1 in 6 young people who say they can't get the hours they need to make a decent living. And underemployment goes hand in hand with casual work, and there's been an explosion of this in Australia over the last 25 years. Unfortunately, though, it's been almost entirely concentrated in the under-25 workforce. The number of young people working casually in Australia today has jumped from 34% in 1992 to over 50% today. Over that same time, the proportion of people working casually in their later years has barely moved. Now, those gaps that have opened up between young and old on underemployment and casualisation are worrying enough. But for the starkest illustration of the growing inequality, we simply need to look at wages. Thanks to Thomas Piketty and those Occupy Prats, you're probably aware that there's been a steady swelling of wage inequality in developed economies over the last few decades. But while there's been plenty of fiery debate about this growing gap between the rich and the rest, I'm yet to see anyone point out that wage inequality is also mushrooming between different age groups. The gap is opening up because over the last 20 years, wages have grown about twice as fast for people over 50 as they have for people under 25. In 1990, a 20-something worker who managed to get into the jobs market before that recession hit was earning about $750 a week in today's money. Now, it's not exactly high rolling, but when you factor in that a worker in their mid-50s was only earning $220 a week more, seems fair enough. Skip ahead to 2013, and an under-20s worker is now earning about $940 a week. But their grey-haired colleagues have left them in their dust. Workers in their 50s now earn over $1,550 a week. As a result, that wage gap has opened out to over $600 a week. A fact that explains the success of all those god-awful 60s revival musicals, if nothing else. Now, there's never going to be a time when young Australians just starting out in work enjoy the same wages or security or conditions as more mature workers. It's just not how the jobs market works. But there was once a time, within my own lifetime, when the workplace gaps between young and old were far smaller than they are now. If we let those gaps continue to grow unarrested, young Australians could well end up as an underclass of workers. Insecure, unprotected and inadequately paid, teens and 20-somethings will be left looking on as the benefits of good work increasingly accrue to their elders. Plenty will also find themselves stuck as they age, with a lack of skills and opportunity locking them into the precariat for life. All right, strap in, because now we're going to talk about wealth and debt. That naturally brings us to the subject of housing affordability, a topic so divisive in Australia at the moment that I think we can officially upgrade it from barbecue stopper to Christmas lunch ruiner. I don't own a house. I did, briefly, but my stint as a member of the propertied class ended a couple of years ago when, at the age of 28, I decided life as a suburban wife and mother was exactly as airless as Betty Friedan had described it. I left the house, and the husband with it, and fled back to a rented flat in the inner city. We'd only been able to buy the place because a confirmed bachelor uncle of my ex's had died and left us an unexpected lump sum. Even then, the best we could do was a falling down 1970s three-bedder in the northern back blocks of Canberra, sort of suburb where you'd more readily find meth than methode traditionnelle at the local shops. I won't pretend I was all that sad to leave the place behind. So now I am back among the 60% of people aged 25 to 34 who bed down in the negatively geared nest eggs of grey-haired investors. 30 years ago, I'd have been well in the minority to still be renting at my age. But today, you have to reach far into the late 30s age bracket before you find more than half of the group owning their own home. And this is a relatively recent development, although we seem to have got quite used to it. In the 12 years since I first moved out of home, ownership rates among young Australians have plummeted. As we saw only a few weeks ago with the release of the latest Hilda survey data, home ownership is now at its lowest ever level among young Australians, with just 36% of people in their late 20s and early 30s having made it into the property market. As I'll talk about a bit later on, that directly affects the choices we make about things like partnering up, pushing out kids, and putting down roots. But just as importantly, my generation's inability to get into the property market early is going to have lifelong repercussions for the amount of wealth that we can accrue. Those coming up after us are going to be even more financially dispossessed unless we act to fix the skews in the system that favour our propertied elders. Since 2004, the Australian Bureau of Statistics has been monitoring the net worth of people at different stages over the life cycle. That's the value of everything they own once all their debts and liabilities are taken into account. Household net worth for people under 24 grew by about $24,000 over the decade between 2004 and 2014. People in their mid-50s and early 60s saw their net worth grow by $286,000. Pretty respectable bump in anyone's book, no? My cohort? Yeah, we went backwards. People aged 25 to 34 are worth $500 less in 2014 than people the same age in 2004. There's a reason I still make my mum and dad pick up the tab when we go out to dinner. The unspoken compact that young people will enjoy more prosperous lives than their parents is breaking down, and that break starts with us. If you want more proof, consider this. Between 2004 and 2014, net worth for everybody over 45 grew by more than the total net worth for people under 24. As a result, the wealth gap between young and old has widened out by hundreds of thousands of dollars, from about $860,000 in 2004 to over $1.2 million in 2014. The price of housing plays a huge part in the story of growing wealth gaps. It almost single-handedly explains why my cohort has gone backwards compared with people the same age a decade ago. Because buying a home at 35 instead of 25 has lifelong consequences. For a start, it likely means a decade longer paying off that mortgage as you age. The average Australian mortgage today is about $461,000. Now that's a sum that would take two people earning an average income, paying 20% of that, about 20 years to pay off before you factor in interest. Take out that mortgage at 25 and you can be debt-free by the time you're 50, while having owned an asset that's jumped in value to boot. But wait until you're 35 or 40 or later, and you're still going to be paying that mortgage when you start planning your 60th birthday party. Not having property to your name is also a problem if you want to start a business or do anything else that requires major borrowing too. Building your own company or investing in someone else's idea is another way that people in previous generations, my mum and dad included, have grown wealth over their lifetimes. But if a bank won't lend you the seed money because you've got nothing to secure it against, then that source of wealth creation slips away too. I don't think this point comes up enough when talk turns to the social and economic impact of higher house prices. So the problem isn't only that my generation has gone backwards in wealth today because of our inability to get into the property market. An equally pressing predicament is that this is actually going to hamper our ability to become financially secure over our lifetimes. Now, the other side of that wealth story is debt, and today's teens and 20-somethings are lugging more of it than ever before. Huge house prices are, again, at the centre of that story, but rising education costs and the easy availability of credit are also part of the problem. Having been on both sides of that property divide, I'm really actually not sure which is worse. It does worry me that I'm steaming into my 30s without any way to secure my financial future. But for the 2 years that the ex and I did own a house, the thought of our piled debts never failed to cause me chest constrictions. The place cost us almost $420,000, despite one end of the kitchen rising fully 4 centimetres above the other because the house was slowly sinking into the claggy backyard. It faced the street on these flaking wood-framed windows, and once an entire section of those frames came away in my hand when I reached to stop from falling down the front step. The hallway between our bedroom and our living room had a snaking crack in it, almost wide enough for me to fit my index finger into. Everyone says buying your first home is hard. Everybody knows you have to take on a burden of debt to do it. But the quantum of that debt is vastly different for young mortgagees today than it was for people in previous generations. This means that those previous generations had a financial breathing room that few young mortgagees feel today. That's because in 1985, the average home loan held by a first home buyer was about $83,000 in today's money. Today, that average is up to $308,000. That much debt wouldn't be such a problem if the price of everything else was rising alongside it. But unfortunately, it's just not. In particular, wages are now growing at their slowest rate on record, and inflation is falling through the floor, which means that those debts are going to hang around our necks much longer than they did in previous decades. The excessive price of housing has created this drowned if you do, starved if you don't situation for today's young Australians. Those who are locked out of the property market are seeing opportunities for wealth creation recede off into the distance. But those who can get across the threshold are suffering a huge hit to their disposable income today and for the foreseeable future, and all for much less gain than people in previous generations enjoyed. Now, that situation's only exacerbated by the fact that my friends and I have debts our parents were blissfully unencumbered with when they were still fit and firm. Chief amongst these is student debt. In 2004, under 25s had an average of $3,500 more debt than their parents. Today, that average is up to $6,500. Now, that might not seem like much, but remember that's an average across the entire age group, and only about 40% of people go to university these days. So the debt gap between people who've been on a university campus in the last 10 years and those free-riding Whitlam graduates now in their 50s and 60s is actually far greater. And God help people coming up after us if fees are further increased or deregulated entirely, as this government seems determined to do. Now, lest you think there is nothing I don't blame older generations for, there is one part of the debt problem that we have to take responsibility for. We have a problem with credit. I won't pretend we don't. Long dead are the days my mum and dad used to speak of when furniture or tech would be carefully paid off in fortnightly instalments before being paraded proudly home. Now anything you want's just a pay wave away, and far too many of us tap and go into debt. Consumer research from Roy Morgan found that young Australians under 25 roll over an average of $2,500 in credit card debt from month to month without paying it off. When researchers from Victoria University surveyed the financial habits of young Melburnians, they found that people in their 20s, over 40% of them said they rarely or never paid off their credit card at the end of the month. And over half of those who had a credit card also reported regularly maxing it out, which is a bit of a worry considering the average credit limit was $4,500. So yes, we have a problem. We rack up debts bigger than we can afford to pay off each month, and we really shouldn't. But there are some important social factors that I would argue underpin our relationship with credit. For a start, it's now crazily accessible and seemingly so cheap, until you read the fine print. Since the deregulation of Australia's banking sector in the late 1980s, it's become progressively easier to get loaded up with plastic. One of the reasons that people in previous generations weren't such big debtors was because few people were actually offering them credit. I really doubt my mum and dad would have been such patient lay-by payers if they'd had the option to bring their booty home right away. But now you can get credit anywhere, with the bar set as low as, can you afford a couple of bucks a month for the minimum repayments? There's also the fact that, as I mentioned a few minutes ago, far too many young Australians are struggling through with work that is insufficient, insecure, or both. When that's the case, credit becomes a necessary stopgap for smoothing out holes in your weekly budget or dealing with big expenses that loom out of the blue. The point I'm making is that our credit dependence is a symptom of some bigger economic problems, and those underlying maladies won't be cured simply by cutting up everybody's cards. I didn't grow up thinking that I would be packer wealthy as an adult. I didn't even really expect sports star with a serial endorsement contract level of comfort. If it had to say at 9 or 15 what I thought my future looked like, I probably would have described a life a lot like what Mum and Dad had. A house big enough to 10 teenagers in, a new car every 5 or so years, a regular but not too flash holiday house at the beach over Christmas. Naturally, at 9, I would have also said that future house needed its own tap floor and light rig. And at 15, that I would have traded it all for a cardboard box, as long as it wasn't in Canberra. But I certainly believe that the basic template of that life, with its steady accrual of wealth and stability, would have been within my grasp by now. It isn't for me and too many other people my age, and that's something that all Australians should be worried about. If young and old pull apart in wealth, the end result can only be a less connected community. And we joke about technology divides when we watch our grandparents try and manipulate their iPhone, and we lol at our mum and dad when they can't make sense of today's youth slang. But wealth inequality creates real divides. It separates people across cities, and it opens fissures in their habits, their tastes, and their interests. It breaks down understanding, and it creates jealousies. Much more pragmatically, leaving young people to fall behind in wealth goes against the prevailing idea that we should be as financially independent as possible when we're old. The Intergenerational Report, the Murray Financial Systems Inquiry, the Rethink Tax discussion paper, every official word from government says Australia can't afford to keep shelling out for this growing cohort of the grizzled aged. But if we can't start building wealth when we're young, we simply won't have enough of it not to rely on government when we're old. Well, it seems pretty bleak at this point, doesn't it? Stay with me a moment, because there's one more important issue that has to be looked in the face. Younger Australians are falling behind in our wellbeing, as well as at work and in our wealth, as the impact of these trends affect how we live, love, and fit into our communities. Spend time with people my age, and it can start to feel like being happy and contented is also a perk reserved for others than us. In my late teens and early 20s, I had a very dear friend who was into self-harm, like the serious kind. She was beset with many anxieties, and when things all got too much, she would take a Stanley knife and drag it across her paper white inner arms until they blossomed red. Her upper thighs were scarred like a Papuan Highlander's too. She said the cutting felt like getting laid and lifting off in an aeroplane all at once. She said it felt like peace. I think of her often these days, actually, when talk amongst my peers turns to the many pressures that are piling onto us today. As messed up as her chosen method was, I know of plenty of under 30s who would identify with her desire for release. The world out there is darkening the domain inside our heads and dragging down our spirits. And why wouldn't it? The globe is warming around us, yet this useless government continues to stall on action to fix it. Privacy and rights are slowly being sacrificed on the gilded altar of security. Our state continues to sanction discrimination in love, that most basic expression of our humanity. You plunk meta worries like these on top of the pressures I've already talked about, and unhappiness seems to me a pretty rational response. It's also the case that today's young Australians lack much of the private scaffolding that supports good wellbeing, like long-term partnerships, kids, community roots. Our parents disparage us as kidults determined to put off real life as long as possible, but they're wrong. Delaying the milestones of traditional adulthood is all but unavoidable when work and housing are insecure and the future's so uncertain. We're frankly pretty fucking tired of being told that we're feckless, reckless, and failing at life when we're already paying such a price for the instability of our circumstances. The Department of Health reckons the prevalence of issues like anxiety and depression may be up to 3 times higher among young Australians than across the community as a whole. In a survey by the Australia Institute, young Australians were also more likely to report feeling lonely than any other segment of the community, with women in their late teens and early 20s reporting particularly high levels of not-so-splendid isolation. And things seem to be getting worse. In 2 surveys of mental health and wellbeing conducted a decade apart, the instance of anxiety, depression and substance abuse disorders increased more for people 25 to 34 than for any other age group. The proportion of people struggling with those issues when they're young jumped from 1 in 5 to almost 1 in 4. By contrast, for people in their 50s, it held constant at about 15% across that decade. And like I say, why wouldn't my generation be sadder than our olds at the same age? By 30, my parents had a house that wasn't crushing them with debt, 3 kids, steady income, small stash of savings. Today, the data shows that too many young Australians are only beginning to acquire those things at the dawning of their 4th decade. It isn't just material comfort that my friends and I are missing out on because of this delay. Partners, kids, a sense of place that builds up over time from dozens of little and big interactions with your community. These are the struts that support good wellbeing, happiness, contentment. Our circumstances have kicked away those struts, and our wellbeing is wobbling pretty precariously as a result. Ultimately, we need to return some stability and security to young Australians' lives so that all of us have a chance to weave better bonds of connectedness. Importantly too, our parents are going to have to ditch the kidult critiques and start thinking about the ways their choices are constraining ours. In May 2015, the current Secretary of the Department of Prime Minister and Cabinet, Martin Parkinson, got to his feet to deliver the graduating address at the University of Adelaide. Born in the late 1950s, a 20-year veteran of the public service, a graduate of several of Australia's best universities, establishment figures don't come much more established than Martin Parkinson. This is what he told the bright, accomplished young men and women who sat before him on the cusp of their adult lives. My generation has failed you, despite having benefited from massive growth in living standards, income and wealth. We rode the benefits of others' reform efforts and thought that success was our doing. In the process, we conflated self-interest with national interest. We lost sight of the big picture and applauded the things that made me better off, irrespective of the cost to others in our community or to future generations. Your generation is at risk of being the first in modern history whose living standards will be lower than those of their parents. And the longer we wait to address today's challenges, the greater the damage willfully being done to future living standards. I don't think a more honest set of sentences has been spoken by an Australian public figure in a decade at least. Parkinson was prepared to face up to something we all need now admit. Things can't go on as they are. Young Australians are being battered by demographic, economic and technological headwinds that will only gather pace in the years ahead. Our current national settings provide little in the way of shelter from those headwinds. Often, in fact, they make them worse. We're seeing the development of a lopsided Australia where young and old live differently. Good jobs, comfortable wealth and the wellbeing that comes with both are increasingly being concentrated in the gnarled, arthritic hands of older Australians. Meanwhile, younger Australians are being forced to live with less, crappier work, less wealth and worse wellbeing. That inequality is already a reality for my generation. I can't stress to you enough that we carry the weight of it heavily. We experience the unfairness daily in the gap between our means and the milestones of traditional adulthood. We sense it in the divergence between our aspirations and the opportunities in front of us. It's like we're the latecomers to some great national feast, where the guests who arrived before us won't share even the dregs of their wine. If we don't do something about the problems I've laid out here, those coming after us will know deeper inequality still. Now, I said at the start that an equal Australia would be one where young Australians have the same opportunities to build stable, secure lives as our parents and grandparents enjoyed before us. It's not so big an ask, but given current circumstances, it's going to take some big changes to achieve. Young and old Australians alike would have to have a hand in bringing about those changes. So to those of you who are here from those older generations, we don't hold you personally responsible for the problems we're now facing. We know you didn't do this all intentionally or with malice. You just grabbed with both hands the opportunities that were in front of you. You had timing and plenty of luck on your side. But as the damaging impact of current trends on young Australians becomes increasingly apparent, we will hold you accountable for whether you throw up obstacles to change or stand with us in making it. And for those of you who can hear your own life experiences reflected in my words, frankly, we shouldn't rely on them. It's very likely we're going to have to design, fight for and deliver those big changes ourselves. Mum and Dad aren't going to be sweeping in to sort it out and kiss it better this time. Our default positions are cynicism and snark, but being a jaded smartass never fixed anything. Neither did disengagement or despair. Believe me, I well understand the temptation to throw your hands up and say things are stuffed beyond repair. I've felt that tug of fatalism myself. We've got every right to be angry and frustrated and disappointed about the way things have turned out for us. But not one thing will change until we channel those burning, bitter gut reactions into tangible acts. If we're going to build a fairer future for ourselves and coming generations, then we need to get involved. And that starts with believing that it's possible to bring about change through the institutions we have in front of us. Contrary to what you often hear, they're not broken. They're just run by people who have a good incentive to put other people's interests ahead of ours. So join a political party, go to a hearing, make a submission, show up. Above all, let go of this idea that there's something lame about caring too much. What's truly feeble is whinging without being willing to act, because change only gets made when we take responsibility for making it. Tackling inequality of any kind isn't easy. There'll be spats and tantrums on the way as those who've conflated self-interest and national interest are forced to recognise the difference once more. But we'd be failing future generations just as much as those in the past have failed us if we decided it was all too hard. So, as that former US president with great hair and a bit of a fetish for movie star blondes once said, let us begin.
This session was recorded live at the Sydney Opera House and presented by the Sydney Opera House and the Ethics Centre. The Ethics Centre delivers programs and experiences designed to bring ethics to the centre of our life. We offer free counselling for individuals, consulting, leadership and development services. As a non-profit charity, we rely heavily on donations to continue our work, which can be made via our website.